Greetings, everybody. Welcome to our collaborative, Peace Engineering Echo Collaborative. So let's get started. Let's start with a couple announcements. Welcome again to the Peace Engineering Echo Collaborative. It's about transforming perspectives for a sustainable global future. So we need you to imagine, design, and create. That's what peace engineering is all about. On the next slide, please. This is a definition of peace engineering. I'm not going to spend time on it, but you will have access to the slides. And if you need more information about peace engineering, please contact us. Next slide, please. These are the rules of engagement. If you're an engineer or a mathematician, these are the boundary conditions. So this session is being recorded. Please type in your name, email, and affiliation in the chat so we know who you are. If you're not speaking, please mute yourself. We don't want to introduce background noise. We will have a question and answer session after Bruce's presentation. We will be monitoring the chat, so please ask your questions there so we have them ready when we start the Q&A. And if bandwidth allows, that's depend on your region, you may need to turn off your video so you don't waste bandwidth. Next slide, please. The title of today's Peace Engineering Echo Collaborative is Peace Engineering Finance. How might we? It's so important that we address the issue of finance. We tend to kind of put this on the side, and we don't do a good job in educating engineers and practicing. So this talk is so important for the future of not only engineering. We're talking about changing the mindset of every discipline, and we need to create new ones to address global challenges. So I'm very proud to introduce Bruce Gahan to talk about this topic. Next slide, please. Bruce is a colleague and a good friend. He's part of the Peace Engineering Consortium. He believes that we can make a difference. He's an attorney. He's also an economist. He knows a lot about finance and how we can connect the dots and value what we're doing. Whether it's with intended or unintended consequences, we need to put a value to it. Bruce, thank you so much for giving this presentation, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Ramiro, thank you for inviting me. It's great to see everybody so early in the morning. I am still on my first half cup of coffee, so hopefully I'll be somewhat sane. As Ramiro said, I think there's a level of financial engineering that should be built up, taught alongside of peace engineering. And in the rooms that I seem to wander into, whether it's at Stanford or UNM or elsewhere, finance is a missing language. And so we have to overcome that. You've heard my bio. I'm a recovering Wall Street lawyer, Hong Kong merchant banker, geospatial technology finance pioneer for the federal government, 9/11 responder, Ashoka Fellow, and I teach finance and ethics at Stanford in the School of Engineering and in the design school. I do a lot, so it confuses people that I do what I do. But in the gold area, you see the activities of relevance that I pursue that I think relate to peace engineering. So don't be confused. You know, if we look at the universe of finance, it helps to know where you want to go. And traditionally, finance is full of jargon and acronyms, and it's opaque. And you know, you can go to investopedia.com and figure out what it is and what it isn't. Finance's main purpose is to name, grade, transfer, pool, and hide risks as compared to their returns on investment. As I've talked to Ramiro and others in the ECHO project, I think that we could compute a return on peace, an ROP. So these are the constraints that engineers would well understand that finance navigates by. Finance connects a spectrum of time horizons and risks, risk appetites, and lives, whether it's the short-term trading of hedge funds and venture capital, the patient capital of pension funds. This is a Rubik's Cube that matches a particular investment, the way it's been structured, to the customer or the investor for that. It's important to realize that finance, until relatively 2 decades ago, really was a laggard in technology adoption, particularly as it came to data science. That there were many industries that finance serves that were going much more rapidly toward computerization and using that data. And much of the data that's spun off of the industries that finance funds isn't yet fully appreciated or used in finance for risk determinations. These new technologies, I mean, finance has been adopting new technologies forever. The check was a technology. The credit card was a technology. ATMs are a technology. But the technologies don't necessarily, they may change how we move money. They don't necessarily change the impacts or even the feedback loops for the impacts that finance creates. So some say banks will never change, and yet we see that traditionally banks did not take into account the impacts of their loan portfolios. That is changing, not fast, but it is changing. And data science, particularly as we've discussed with Ramiro and the possibility of the various national labs and other data sources coming to the table for this is very exciting to aim evidence-based finance into the world. So it is a maze of actors. I used this report from 2010. This is right after the financial crisis. This is a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where they try to understand what in the world blew up in 2010. So it was kind of a forensic analysis. And they analyzed the shadow banking system. And the shadow banking system isn't mafia, though I guess that would qualify. It's the un or less regulated portions of the financial system. Things like private equity, limited partnerships, or some of the pension funds and the rest that invest in not bank regulated. The bank regulated in this slide is just the top layer that you see, everything bounded in gold and green and purple. These are the unregulated actors, but it's very much necessary for the regulated banking system to move investment risk outside itself into pools of investors who want to buy that risk and hold that risk. Think about a swap agreement. Will interest rates go up or down, or a currency swap? There are many, many of those types of financial instruments. But really, all this circuit board, and you know, I'm talking to electrical engineers on this call, so you'll correct me, of course. All this circuit board, if it were a circuit board, if this financial system were on a chip, is doing, it's transforming risk, return, asset type, and maturity. How long is the money in that form? And so it's very much like a circuit that moves things. It doesn't do it as efficiently as digital circuits, and there's costs and delays and handling um, charges, if you will, for the way that the system is used in its analog function. But ultimately, finance relies on the real economy. The real economy is different than the financialized or synthetic economy. The real economy is something that feeds people or makes them healthy or lets them travel. So those are the real economic activities that if you were to draw a picture of what the banking and the financial systems are really doing, it might look like this. And this is a slide that took 4 hours to discuss and negotiate with a good friend who headed the Aeroastro department at Stanford. He said, Bruce, you got one slide to explain the entire banking system. This after 4 hours is what we came up with. So depositors put their money into banks. The bank owes them safety. The bank puts that money into investments, which are really claims on real assets. So they can be a fixed rate of interest or variable, or the banks trade funds between themselves. And then the real assets are people or businesses or cities. And to the extent that we need liquidity so that when you would go to the ATM, you could get cash, or businesses can pay their workers. Some of those funds are left in uninvested form. But the entire system is riding on the impacts of that real asset layer. And that's where peace engineering, I think, can make a huge contribution to stabilizing and making certain that the financial system is sustainable and doesn't speculate beyond it. So here you see spread. Banks live on the difference between what they earn on their investments or loan portfolios and what they have to pay for deposits, which is usually negligible. And then banks really don't know how to operate real assets. They don't know how to operate a hotel or a farm or a business. So to the extent that they would have the business intelligence of what impacts are needed and what proportion to others, they would make better decisions on the real assets that they want to be funding to create, and trust would be greater because people would know where their money lived last night when they slept, and that would be good for the system to be more transparent as to its impacts and how the loans will be repaid or the investments will pay off. Economics does explain a lot of the process for moving capital to its highest purpose. This is something called the integrated reporting framework. And it hypothesized that there are 6 forms of capital. And if in the middle you imagine that's a company, the company is taking inputs of financial, manufactured, intellectual, human, social, and natural capital. So those are the inputs. And the outputs are, they have changed and hopefully added to and not degraded those forms of capital. And there's some companies that are starting to report in addition to their required financial reports, they're reporting their integrated framework impacts. So I've suggested that we need storytelling money, and there are stories that the depositors or the investors, when you invest in your retirement funds, you represent a story, or you like to think you are a story. And then the party, the invested company, or the borrower from bank would be also a story. Maybe they are a sustainable food grower or restaurant or whatever. or they build health for vulnerable regions. Well, a sustainable bank or a sustainable investment fund puts those two stories together and lets people see that their money actually is creating safety, fairness, and impacts through knowing where the money was invested and the relative importance of that activity in the real economy. For this, I've decided that we need a periodic table of impacts, which I call a periodic table of quality of life. And when I started to research that, and I went back and I looked at the early periodic charts, I saw two amazing things. One was that the scientists of the day used the periodic table to be their shareware, to be their Wikipedia, to say this is what we know to measure, and this is how it relates to other things we know to measure. But they also did something incredibly humble, which was they left blank spaces for things they didn't know would be what to call them or how to measure them. Excuse me. But they knew those elements must exist for the entire table to make sense. And as life has gone on, and as the national labs and others have found with their NSF activity, we've changed some of the atomic weights and found new elements. Well, what if we were to build a periodic table of quality of life elements right now? We might start with health. Health is pretty important during a pandemic period, and we would find that, you know, we could budget as much as we want. We could build a lot of hospitals and health clinics. This is very important, I think, for the Pueblos in New Mexico. But one of the reasons that people get sick has to do with the urban systems and the engineering of those urban systems, or the failures to re-engineer and clean up the water and the sanitation, the other things. And then you would ask, well, what is the source of energy that those that city where those people live are using? Is it polluting the air? And then you would ask, how is that contributing perhaps to climate change? So in a very few mouse clicks, I've shown you a couple of key concepts for the periodic table of quality of life. Adjacencies, how do the various elements relate to each other? Does having more urban engineering reduce the cost of healthcare? The functional values at risk. This borrows a concept called VAR, or value at risk, which fund managers would ask, well, if I buy or sell an Apple stock today, what is that going to do to my overall portfolio yield a year from now? And so I put an F in front of the VAR for functional value at risk. What is the functional value to all the other elements in the table being in balance of having better urban systems or better energy, etc.? And then sustainable resiliency is a score that I've designed for the table that says, what is the likelihood over 10 years that there will be at least a 10% improvement in every element of our table, based on balancing the kind of technologies and investments that we make. And this periodic table is driven off of government budget data. So you can imagine looking at the state of New Mexico's budget over the last 10, 20 years and filling in this table with both the amounts that were spent and the KPIs, or key performance indicators, that were moved with those investments. Switching to topics that I think we all care about is people are hurting. Many people are hurting. And this is a chart that shows 5 slices of Americans. The bottom 20% owe 25% more than they have in net worth. The second owe 80% of their net worth. The middle owe a half of their net worth. The next owe 20% or 25% of their net worth. And that means that if finance is just making people in debt, putting people in debt faster, like credit card debt, that's not necessarily healthy. It's technologically fun, but it's not healthy. And so I focus, and I like to explain that I focus on that blue Pac-Man slice of the pie of all the global GDP that is represented by the financial system. And you can't move the impacts of that pie merely by impact investing. It's just a scale that cannot, mathematically work. So we really have to look at how banks and financial markets are using data such as the periodic table would show for government finance debt, for example. I like to show this chart, especially early in the morning, because we wake up in a normal population with a variety of personality types, and we need the diversity, the full diversity of those personality types. Nature has evolved us to have those in our communities, so that we can have risk taking, and we can have folks asking, is it safe? And that's a healthy debate. Unfortunately, the banker personalities don't match the normal personality. So, quoting from young Frankenstein, they are abnormal, or I am abnormal as a banker. And the importance of that dichotomy is that that society is trying to use the bankers, and by that I mean the financial markets as well, to allocate capital, but the way in which the receiver of that information or the proposer of that investment is hearing it isn't necessarily the way the personality types in the society would want that capital to flow. So if the financial system is a gatekeeper for social capital, you've got a mismatch, and basically you have some augmented personality, intervention that the financial system might need from evidence-based data that can show bankers why the real economy would be strengthened by certain portfolio investments. Then, of course, as a lawyer, I have to show you this because I am a lawyer in 3 states. Lawyers are not normal people either, if you've ever interacted with lawyers. And so you've got a society where the normal decision-making processes are certainly in large part in the hands of people who are not representative of the normal tolerance for risk and prioritization of attention. And so we need some technology to overcome these structural personality disorders, let us say. Economics is a unifying language, and it certainly helped me to have conversations I had planned, but also some that I had not. And here you see I've ended up at the Vatican and meeting the Pope, and courtesy of my friend Cardinal Turkson, and I happen to be a Jewish boy from Philadelphia. And I suggested by sneaking a redwood seedling tree into the Vatican, wrapped in a Stanford shawl, that we need banks that can help us make decisions that last as long and stand as tall as these trees. The Pope has been incredibly outspoken about the need for the financial system to look at its impacts, to look at how it works. And I've, courtesy of Cardinal Turkson and a few others, had input into helping to think about how to do that. You know, how the Vatican has a bank and it runs an asset management function to do that. This is actually a nutrition facts label that that we developed. Father Seamus and I developed for managing Catholic funds. So, are they managed compliant with law, which hasn't always been the case? For the amount of risk that they take, are they prudently invested? And then most importantly, are they congruently invested? I can earn a return by investing in things that would be against the doctrine, and that how do we have the transparency to see this? And most religious institutions, whether it's Catholic or Jewish or others, do not report on this type of transparency level. Mostly because their investment managers are not reporting it to them. So data do speak for the poor and planet. And unfortunately, there is no economic model that I've found for informal settlements or slums that could show how to pay people who live in a slum to reduce the threats to themselves, whether it's disease or other threats. And when I looked out in the research, I found lots of conversations about economics and lots of nice diagrams. But I did not find an economic model. So I decided that we needed it and that we could use these quality of life impacts, basically teeing off of the government's expenses and exposures to risk from the slums, to reward people for cleaning up trash or doing other things that they might be able to do. I'm part of a group funded out of Wellcome Trust in the UK to retrofit 12 slums in Fiji and 12 in Indonesia with clean water and sanitation. But typically with these development projects, if you go back 3 to 5 years later, there's the intervention, the infrastructure has not been maintained. So it doesn't, it's a nice photo op, it doesn't make a difference. So for that, I decided to create or propose a general economic model so that we could make a bridge between the formal and the informal economies, knowing that 70 to 80% of people who live in a slum have a cell phone and therefore could get a micropayment on their cell phone. And this is, an early draft of the GEM, as I call it, the General Economic Model. And it has a number of modules, the periodic table, a 3-layered map of the world. So this is where our friends at Sandia and the other national labs could be incredibly helpful. What are the needs? What are the gaps in the KPIs of the periodic table? What are the capacities for cleaning water under similar circumstances? Is something in Indonesia and something in Israel similar enough from a chemical point of view or a weather point of view that you could use the capacity from one in the other? And then the money layer. Often we find that the people who can tell you there's a need, the NGOs, know that there's money to solve it or have been responsible for collecting the money to solve it. Or the contractors or others with capacities know how to find the money to pay for it. But that leaves out the people who live in the slums, in this case, from just learning any self-determinism of prioritizing among all the different interventions, which is most needed. insularity and interdependency. How far is the slum or the affected area, the fragile area, from the city? Because that distance might represent a value constraint. What are the macro factors outside of local and regional controls? Certainly weather, politics. What are the legacy, cultural, and religious economic traditions? In my studies, every religion or indigenous tradition has an economic component, and you can leverage that to with behavioral economics to cause people to act congruently to that belief system. The external investment and funding decisions, these are the annual, RFPs and the episodic, we have money to do this, that, and the other thing from people who don't live in the area that you're trying to affect. And then, of course, there's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, none of which have any budgeting consequence. The cities and states typically do not budget to achieve those goals, but to translate this activity from the GEM into a language that the SDGs have created, we can do that. So I think this is a new science of wellness and empowerment, and for that, I think we could have sustainable resiliency bonds as an example of moving beyond impact investing, or what I've called vanity philanthropy, and the one ring to rule them all. If you don't care about climate change, forget about curing poverty, because we won't be here. I mean, let's stop that nonsense. Everything matters in some proportion to everything else. So this would be using the various modules that you've seen me describe, but using a city's output of risk in a much different way, so as to give the bondholders assurance that the money that they have provided by buying the bonds is allocated to optimizing the balancing of risk through the periodic table and the other means. This is true. All great changes are preceded by a bit of chaos, and certainly there's enough chaos in the world so that we have hopefully see some great changes in how we think and act. And impacts could be a commodity that we start to trade for the better. And with that, I know Ramiro had some questions that we could consider, but why don't I just go to the chat? I've not been looking at it, and Ramiro, if you can take us through a dialogue, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. I know there's a lot of interest here, and I have a lot of also questions that I would like to ask, but I want to pass to the audience. I know this is what you just talked has a direct connection to a previous peace engineering echo on health and climate change that Haiti Rogers gave, where she addressed the two things that are going to have major impact soon, if not already, is migration and infrastructure. And how do you finance that? And I think you touched that right smack. Oh, Haiti's here. Hi, how are you? So I will, if you can just, let's start with that. I mean, how can we use these bonds, the impact bonds, to finance this? Because we need, and the other thing that we talked several times is transparency. It's so important.
So I actually have a project in the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Stanford that we call the Migration Storytelling Project. And this, I'm not obsessed with periodic tables, but imagine a second periodic table. And imagine that every migration journey goes through an arc. and it starts with a set of catalysts, conditions in the place that people have left. Some are normal, some are not normal conditions. Then the people start leaving and they settle wherever they settle, either because they're exhausted or because they're welcomed. And then they have another set of conditions. And then finally, in the third part of the story, third act, occasionally they get to go back to their homeland. And what are the conditions for that? This, the periodic table that I described of quality of life will be involved in all three parts of that journey. What we wanted to do, particularly for the purpose of normalizing migration as a responsible human activity, is to say, you know, your family, Ramiro, and my ancestors went through different migration journeys. But the elements, if I were to semantically tag the stories, would be very similar. There was economic opportunity, there was some threats, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we could understand each other's migration journey in the semantics of it, we would have a little more empathy, and we'd probably, from policy making and economic activity, be able to anticipate how to normalize the folks who are making these choices, and not deal with it as if it's some great surprise, because it is. The triggers are well known. People who work in this area, you know, can explain that. What has not been done is to accommodate the investment structures so that you are building schools or businesses with the people who are migrating to maximize. So for instance, if they're migrating from an agricultural area and we have food insecurity, sounds like the people who are coming into the area might know how to feed people.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm gonna reach out to Donna to help us with the questions in the chat. Heidi, you wanna? I know I used your the punchline of your talk to get the dialogue started, but it's you may want to expand or say anything.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. This has just been such an incredible treat this morning. So thank you so much. And as the nursing member of the peace engineering community, I just deeply appreciate how we're all thinking about human resilience and what all of those qualities are, because you know we think about that a lot in nursing. What are the things that we need to be able to flourish? And I think one of the pieces from the talk that I gave last week is, you know, this idea of, because it was really about climate change, is this idea of climate migration that is actually just, you know, it's not for economic opportunity. It's because of a, you know, just this like, you know, this deficit hazard thing. And I've just been mulling around this idea of like, you know, sheltering in place as a concept, and what is it that we can, how can we harness all of this work that we're doing to help people flourish in their communities where they already have social connection, since social connection is one of those key components to health and resiliency. We know that, you know, after a natural disaster, people who have social connection are less likely to have food insecurity, are less likely to have to become chronically homeless, all of those things. And so I just, you know, I don't know that I have a question. I just wanted to like say right on that you're doing this really cool work, and thank you so much.
You know, I mean, you're right, Heidi. I just think many of the things that we've seen as inconvenient risks are really disguised assets, but we just haven't built the economic foundations which would then lead, if I can't if I can't quantify something as a banker or an investor, I can't move the money to it. So until we can create the KPI, the key performance indicator, whatever it is, and it's not for the bankers and the investment professionals to do that. It's up to everybody but the bankers, because you saw the personality issues there. You gotta quantify, what is the contribution of migrants to various societies? They may be in a first year, second year, third year burden, but 5 years out, are they really the burden that you thought that they were? Or were they the way to reinvigorate a mining town or an industrial age town that nobody else wanted to be in for whatever reason? So I do think we've mislabeled certain things, and we now need, the benefit of whether it's IoT and geospatial and every other thing that we have as data science to label things as they really truly act in the real economy.
Other questions? Donna, can you help me?
Yes. Mary Eggert has a question. Mary, would you go ahead and ask that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. And just many people talk about the issue of our not using a gold-backed currency, the issuance of money contributing to the great wealth divide with the debtors, never being able to catch up because of inflation. What is your view on that, Bruce? And how do you suggest it be resolved?
Well, I guess there are some who believe in Bitcoin. I think it's nice to be able to tether. So if you study the Transcontinental Railroad, it is a story of whether this country would have a silver or gold-backed currency, and there was hyperinflation when the colonies just kept issuing their own colonial money that Alexander Hamilton thought a national bank could tamp down, as well as provide some solvency to those colony governments. We need a basket of real goods to back the currency. Typically, the definition of what is a fiat currency is whatever the government accepts for tax payments. And some state and local governments are starting to collect taxes and accept Bitcoin. Now, I don't know what would happen if Bitcoin collapsed, but they are starting. I am not advocating for investments in Bitcoin, but I am suggesting that the ability to move money through that maze of circuitry that I showed you before is incredibly compressed. There's some good studies out of the World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, looking at the future of the financial system and looking at what happens when you have those circuits, those gates that move money in accordance with, let us say, the Internet of Things data, or where you need more energy cheaper, or where you need agriculture to be moved to a different type because of climate change. So I'm in favor of currency that is backed by the real economy. This is my belief that it's simpler for me to follow. Gold was a store of value, which is one of the functions of money. And it was very stable because it had a store of money, it had a store of value function, but it was also used in industry. Bitcoin is not, it may or may not be a store of value, but it is not used in industry.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And it brings to mind just water as a monetary standard. Like if we suddenly
Yep.
backed every country, I don't know if there's a guy who has that proposal I can send to you.
Yeah, sure, please. Here, I'll put my email in the chat. I think there are many. I'm actually creating a commodities exchange for outer space, launch, bandwidth, debris removal. So I'm in this for good or
Wow.
bad, and that's a different talk. And I do talk to the Space Forcey kind of people, and they're it's important to have a balancing of how much you invest in producing particular commodities. So you wouldn't want to overinvest in launch systems and not, when you get launched to some orbit, have something there to do something else with. You would want energy there. You would want debris removal there. So you, as you've seen in the Great Tulip and even the subprime crisis, if you overinvest in any particular asset type beyond what the real economy needs it to perform relative to the other things, you get a collapse not only in the asset's value, but in all the investments that go sour, who are collateralized by that asset or the functions of that asset. So you
Right.
need to, which is the beauty of peace engineering, as strongly Ramiro and I and Donna have been talking about, is that we're looking at a balanced approach to how do regions stay in balance, because it's in that balance that they actually have safety, that they actually are providing for enough of everything. You're never going to have too much of health or whatever, but you could have people saying, well, if you don't put solar roofs on everybody's houses, then you're not providing adequately. Well, I don't want solar roofs on houses in places where they take the solar, sell it to pay for their health care, and in the meantime commit crime. I mean, so let's get off of this who is more virtuous by having allegiance to a particular aspect type of strategy.
Bruce, this is Raj.
Hey,
I have a
Raj.
question about your concept of funding infrastructure for slums and poor communities is very interesting, but they don't have a voice in the political system. So who is going to speak up for them saying, and I have heard and seen slums in India where they just grab whatever utility they can, they just take the existing electric wire and put a dangerous connection to it to their home. And same thing they do with water, So this is something we cannot ignore. Otherwise, our slums will become, invade the nicer areas of our communities.
Look, Raj, in the days when you could, I went and gave a talk in Istanbul, and they explained to me how every election season, the politicians walk through the slums and they can see all this extension wire, so to speak, of people taking the energy or the telephone for free. And the politicians come through, they promise to upgrade, they never do.
Yeah.
I just think with the digital tools in hand, people who live in slums could have more agency in determining in that three-layered map that I quickly reviewed, a layer of money, capacities, and needs, that they could hold themselves and the politicians to account for the sustainable resiliency, this balance of the periodic table that keeps their kids and their slum so bad. I'd like to try the experiment, because I don't see the experiment of keeping all the decisions in New York or Washington or other places as being so eminently practical or wise. I think there's enough behavioral economics, but also, and you saw me just briefly touch on it, often these slums are in areas where people are faith observant,
Yeah.
or are faith, I don't know,
Believers.
they have a culture of, they have a culture of faith, and each of the faiths have an economic reality. I know the Jewish story, I know some of the other Abrahamic stories, and why don't we provide the data that invoke the cultural norms of that economic tradition, to the extent that those traditions would improve the conditions that are around them. If you don't give people agency, they never learn to make a decision for themselves.
Yeah.
So telling them they don't know how to make a decision isn't really on them. And I think we can change that, and we have to.
Yes. I will write you a note about that further. Thank you.
Sure.
Next question, please, Donna.
We have a quick question about what was the source of the personality data? And then after that, George Rowe has a question and Josh Sperling has a question.
So I was in New York for 25 years, and my ex-wife was a Freudian psychiatrist. That would be the flippant answer. But the true answer is that it comes from there is a Myers-Briggs website. And if you really push me, I will go back and give you the sources on all of that. So give me a second and I'll come back to it. Here. So I'll share the screen right again. So here are the sources.
Can I just jump in? I asked the question. Can I be heard?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. I'm Mindy Reiser. Of course, with a change in the overall economic and social system, the definitions of the personality types will shift. And that would be wonderful. We do have people who are drawn to law specifically for civil rights issues and human rights issues. And presumably they're a small percentage of the larger population. But again, as things change, even a new administration can shift things, can shift who decides to join the Justice Department. So again, these are not fixed categories. They're taken at a certain point, at a certain time, and I don't know what the dates are. But it would be interesting to do such evaluations of personality types over time and in different countries with different legal systems, economic systems, and so forth.
Yeah, no, Mindy, you raise a good point. I'm part of Stanford's Center for Legal Informatics. We call it Codex. We just had our Future Law conference last week. And having legal tech that can fill gaps for personality blind spots in lawyers is really helpful. Not only from a have you considered all possible theories of the case, but there's a version of malpractice risk in having a particular personality, whether it's in the profession of law or medicine or engineering, and thinking because of that personality type that you don't have to look at certain possibilities. So I think as we automate decision making responsibly instead of arrogantly, we will get more of those perspectives into the mix, and that'll be healthy for everybody.
Thank you.
But yeah.
Thank you, Mindy. George?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ramiro, and wonderful presentation. I work for the Department of Energy in the Arctic Energy Office, and so we have many rural communities in Alaska that have multiple challenges that are similar to places in the developing world. And I'm wondering, part of what we need to do is, because there's not a lot of cash base in many of those communities, and so what we're looking at maybe is more of a cost avoidance approach, where helping communities be healthier, more self-reliant, et cetera. It reduces the need for outsiders to provide resources.
Yep.
Are there examples that you can cite that we can point to say like, now look, it works?
So one that I always sticks in my mind, George, is the UN has something called a famine anticipation insurance policy that, and I'll get this explanation not totally accurate, but the way it is designed, and Swiss Re was involved in this, Swiss Reinsurance, is that instead of waiting for the weather pattern to create the drought for the crops not to grow, you see the weather pattern emerge, whatever that season is. And right then you draw on the insurance policy to buy the food, to position it, to feed the people before they starve. And that's an example of insurance we call parametric insurance for the parameter of rainfall that would trigger the claim under the policy. This is a huge opportunity actually in my redesigning finance class this quarter, where we have Munich Re, and we're looking at natural catastrophe insurability. So when you talk about, well, who bears the cost of letting somebody else decline, let's say, or be at risk, it is a much healthier question. But then, George, as you hear in that example, you're not selling the insurance policy to the people who can't afford the food.
Right.
You're selling the insurance policy to the governments or the NGOs or the multinational aid agencies who would otherwise be responding, who are saving the emergency cost of flying in food by having a planned cost for flying in food.
It seems like organizations, it seems like organizations like FEMA would really benefit from something like this by building in anticipatory resilience and things like this. And speaking to your Jewish tradition, it reminds me of Joseph, right? 7 years of gathering.
Yes.
Totally.
Pharaoh got a good Jewish boy to take care of that stuff. You're right. I actually have a proposal for something that I call Skybrella. That we presented to the national, the NSC, and it would, instead of sending cash after a disaster for neighbors to compete against neighbors for construction services, what if we said, we're not sending you cash, we're building a new house, okay? And we're buying those components and those services in bulk. So that's Skybrella, and we can talk about that. And I've tried to have USAID, because we've seen in Haiti, you get 6 houses rebuilt. It's kind of embarrassing, as well as really dangerous for the people who survived the hurricane. And so this is all finance. This is all financial engineering, George. This is saying, don't sit in your ivory towers at Stanford and publish your papers and expect that they're going to be understood on Wall Street or in Munich or wherever. They're not. You gotta, you gotta work this, and you gotta, I'm very lucky to have students that get that they want to be an agent of getting their great ideas financed, not just expecting somebody else to why would you want to depend on whether Congress wants to reauthorize anything? I mean, can we call that BS and let what we need to finance as the real economy and the impacts of safety for the real economy, let's call that finance, and let's do it.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think we're on the hour. I want to thank you, Bruce. Thank everybody. I know there's a lot more questions there. We'll collect them, send them to you, Bruce. If we have your emails, we'll get back in touch with you. I want to thank everybody for participating in today's collaborative. And again, a special thanks to Bruce. Excellent talk. I mean, we got a lot to do under peace engineering. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, George. Thank you for participating. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe. That's the homework. Stay safe.